Hi, MPS. My name is Jason Ervin, and I have been a member of the Mississippi Poetry Society since 2019. I joined shortly after moving to Jackson to take a job with the Department of Transportation. I kind of traveled around prior to that. I studied mathematics. I grew up in Mississippi in the Delta, studied mathematics at Mississippi State, and then went on and studied mathematics at Auburn University. I lived in Charleston, South Carolina for a few years, came back to Mississippi State and studied archaeology. I spent a summer in Washington, D.C., interning in Washington, D.C., and lived for a summer in the Cascade Mountains in Washington State, working for the U.S. Forest Service on the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest, and then spent another 2 summers working for the Forest Service in New Hampshire on the White Mountain National Forest, all as an archaeologist. And I was in New Hampshire when I was offered the job at MDOT, moved here and joined MPS a few months later. I work as an archaeologist. My education is in mathematics. I have no training in literature or creative writing aside from what everybody gets in high school and college. But I've been interested in creative writing since I was a teenager. Central Branch I joined Central Branch, living in the Jackson area. They were really welcoming and encouraging, and just created a great space, safe space where you felt comfortable, and were very encouraging. I guess I wanted to mention also that since 2022, I've been the coordinator for the annual spring contest, and that's been a very rewarding experience. It's been a privilege to be trusted with that, and I've been really glad to be able to do that. I get to see, we get somewhere between 650, 750 entries every year, and only a handful of them make it to the journal. I get to look at all of them, and that's really been valuable, just getting to see all those poems that I might not otherwise get to see, and also just as coordinator, interacting with people that I might not otherwise interact with. So thank you, MPS, for giving me that opportunity. What is my favorite thing about being an MPS member? My favorite thing about being an MPS member is getting to see the writings of all the members. So I used to go to all the monthly meetings prior to. I was sidelined with some injured muscles and joints in my back that put me out of commission for about 3 years. I'm coming out of that now. But before all that happened, I attended the monthly meetings, and you just, when you do that, when you attend the monthly meetings, the people that come regularly, you hear their poetry regularly, and you really get a little window into their body of work. And it's just so, every person's work is so unique and individual to them, and it just strikes me as being something very valuable. So that's probably been my favorite thing about being an MPS. It's just getting to being afforded that little view into people's work and seeing how unique it is to them. And same thing goes with the contest. I get to see a lot of poems. I don't read them all, but I get to see a lot of them, and you get an appreciation for people's work. Kind of the same thing happens. You get a little view into their body of work and how unique it is to them. That's been my favorite thing, and other than just generally, MPS provides a space for a person to pursue an interest in poetry and to be inspired and to learn. So that's the other thing. What kind of poetry do you typically write? And I'm going to answer that in 2 parts. In terms of subject matter, a lot of my poetry is inspired by nature. So nature, I've always had a close relationship with nature, big part of my life. So a lot of my poems are inspired by that. I write poems inspired by mathematics, because that also has been a big part of my life. I write poems inspired by science. I write poems about people that I meet and observe. I also write poems about my travels. So prior to this whole thing coming up with my back, I traveled all over the state with with MDOT, or on behalf of MDOT, as an archaeologist. And doing that, I got to meet a lot of people all over the state and just listen to them tell me things. And that was the inspiration for a lot of poems I've written. It's just things that people have told me on my travels. Hopefully I'll get back to that. I'm getting better. Hopefully I'll be doing that again. I've been kind of stuck in the office for 3 years writing reports. Humor is a big part of my writing. So other people might not think it's funny, but I do, and that's good enough, as Dave Chappelle says. Let's see, sometimes I'm attracted to a story. In particular, I was attracted to the character of Jezebel from the Bible, which a lot of people might find kind of strange, given that Jezebel is a villain. They might think it's a little odd to write about her, but I find her story very compelling because the Bible's account is so unbalanced, that I don't know. It's just I'm very interested in fleshing out that story and looking at things the way she might have looked at them, and exploring how she might have looked at things and what happened. So I get interested in a character sometimes like that. And Jezebel is one such character. If I even considered writing a novel I wrote a long poem about Jezebel. I've even considered writing a novel about her, based on her. So that's what I write about. In terms of the forms I write in, I don't write formal verse very much at all. That doesn't mean I don't pay attention to rhythm or that I don't pay attention to rhyme. I use both. I'm conscious of rhythm in my writing, and I use rhyme a lot too. But I don't sit down and typically write specific forms. I just don't do that. But one thing I do is put a big premium on experimentation. I really like to experiment with form and try unconventional things. So to that end, I've written poems that were based on equations, or that started off as equations and I turned them into poems. I've written poems that are computer programs. So, and some of those programs actually compile and run. I've written poems that consisted of just symbols. They didn't have any words in them at all. They were just symbols. I've written poems that were all numbers. I make up words a lot. That kind of stuff. I tend to deliberately throw aside the rules of grammar just because it seems to free me up to think out unconventionally. So that's something I put a big premium on. That's something I try to do, is really try unconventional forms. In fact, it's one of my main motivators. It's one of the main things that motivates me to write, is experimenting with form, really out there, unusual forms. It's one of my big motivators. That said, I wanted to mention also I always sponsor a category. Every contest I sponsor one category. So typically those unconventional things are kind of risky in a contest context. You're probably, unless you know the contest is looking for that, specifically for that kind of stuff, you turn in something really unconventional, you're probably not going to win. That's just a fact. But with my category, that's what I'm looking for. I sponsor that category every year, and that's what I'm trying to encourage people to do, is to try unconventional things. So since I've got a captive audience, I thought I would put a plug in, thought I would make that, try to clarify that if you ever submit to my category, you're not going to do something too crazy for me, because that's what I'm looking for. What poetry or poets inspire you? Well, I have to admit I'm not well read. If I were a more serious poet, I probably would have read a lot more than I have. I've gone through spells where I tried to read to make myself a better poet. The last 3 years, I've been just trying to survive. That's it. But even before that, I'm not well read. But that said, I do particularly like the modernist poets of the early 20th century, because they seem to me to be experimenting with unconventional things, and that's what attracts me to them. And they're also, I tend to be kind of a minimalist, and they were also kind of minimalist, a lot of them. So that also appeals to me. So if I had to say that any group of poets kind of particularly appeals to me, it would be the modernist poets of the early 20th century. I also like Allen Ginsberg. I like Walt Whitman. There is some famous poetry that I don't like, so I'll answer the question in the negative. I tried to read some epic poems, ancient epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and Beowulf. I know this is probably sacrilege, probably a terrible thing to say. I could not get into it. I tried repeatedly, couldn't get into it. I don't think it was the language that was a problem for me. It was, I just don't, the concept of the mythical hero just doesn't resonate with me. I don't know why. Maybe if I gave it more of a chance, but I just found it very hard to get into that. That being said, I really got interested in the Epic of Gilgamesh. I was looking at the Epic of Gilgamesh as part of my research into Jezebel, because that's presumably a tradition she would have been familiar with and would have been part of her worldview, so I was interested in that. But generally, I have a hard time reading that stuff. I also, as many of you do, look for creative inspiration outside of writers. Orson Welles is somebody that I find fascinating. In fact, he once said something that I thought was interesting. He was talking about a film that he worked on for decades and never finished, but in discussing this film, he said, maybe it's not even the film itself. Maybe the art is not even in the film, it's in the making of the film. And it's kind of, I thought that was kind of a cool idea, if you could apply it to poetry and say, well, I'm going to write a poem where the end poem is not even the point. That it's the artistic process you went through. And the poem is just like an archaeological site. It's just what's left over from a creative process. And the job of the reader in that case is the same as the job of the archaeologist. The archaeologist is less interested in the site in and of itself than he is in interpreting the site, using what's left to try to figure out what happened. That's kind of an interesting idea. I haven't tried to turn that into a poem, but it's something to think about. Kate Bush is somebody I wanted to mention. Singer Kate Bush. If your familiarity with Kate Bush is limited to Stranger Things, you're missing out. She has you should listen to some of her albums. She's an extremely creative person. And she's got a song, for example, where the song is literally her singing the digits of pi, and she makes it fantastic. She's just a very creative person. So I thought I'd mention those two people. You go looking for inspirations outside of poetry. What makes good poetry, in your opinion? I've already said I put a premium on unconventional things. A good poem doesn't have to be unconventional, obviously, but it can be. But more generally, I think a good poem, however, be it conventional or unconventional, or whatever. I think it should be well crafted. It should be real. So it should come from a real place. And when I think about that, I think about some of the poems that I've heard people read in MPS, and it was clear to me that it was coming from a real place, and that resonates with you when it does. Also, maybe, good poems maybe make you look at something in a way that you haven't looked at it before. So those are just some of the hallmarks, I'd say. You could probably never, it would be really hard, obviously, to answer that question comprehensively, but those are some of, I think, the hallmarks of good poetry. Talk about any books or projects that you have going, awards. I have no awards. I don't tend to win contests. Partially maybe because I tend to be unconventional. And I can't blame it on that entirely, but I'll blame it on that partly. So I don't have a lot of accolades, but I am currently working on a book of compilation of the poems that I've written that I like and I think are worth including. So that's a work in progress, a compilation of my poems. And I've also considered a chapbook of I mentioned computer program poems. I've considered a chapbook of computer program poems, where the poems are literally programs that you can actually compile and run, and it's really just an excuse, partly just an excuse for me to learn a little bit more about C++ and Python and JavaScript, etc. Partly excuse to learn more about that, and partly in my quest to write unconventionally. So I have really enjoyed being a member of Mississippi Poetry Society. I went way too long. And thanks, MPS. Talk to you later.